to turn it over to our team of experts from the Office of Labor Standards Enforcement. We will break for questions twice during their presentation, so please remember to send along any questions you have throughout the event to cityadmin.events@sfgov.org. You'll hear from several compliance officers from the Office of Labor Standards and Enforcement today. These are experts in their fields, and they include Lynn Shao Chin, Maura Prendeville, Beverly Popek, Ying Wu, and Bernice Casey. And with that, please welcome to our virtual stage the OLSE team.
Good morning, and thank you for that warm welcome and introduction. My name is Beverly Popek, and I'm a Supervising Compliance Officer at the Office of Labor Standards Enforcement, OLSE. This morning's presentation by OLSE is part of the City Administrator's Small Business Summit, in which OLSE shall present and introduce to you labor laws for businesses operating in the city and county of San Francisco, as well as companies who have contracts or who would like to get contracts with the city and county. OLSE's mission is to enforce labor standards, and today's event is an essential part of our work to ensure that employers like yourself understand labor standards requirements to avoid violations. Also, what's important to remember is that you must understand these requirements to project, budget, and manage your business costs. If you're bidding with the city, you must factor in the cost of compliance into your proposal. Next slide, please. Our presentation has two parts. The first will cover citywide labor laws, and the second will provide information on contracting labor laws. This slide gives you an overview of the presentations today. On the left-hand side, these are the citywide labor laws that we will present: minimum wage, paid sick leave, healthcare security, paid parental leave, family-friendly workplace, lactation in the workplace ordinances. In the center of the slide, these two laws, fair chance and salary history ordinances, are not only citywide labor laws that any business who is operating here needs to understand and comply with, but they're also city contracting labor laws. Then on the far right side, these are the contracting labor laws that we will cover: prevailing wage, minimum compensation, and healthcare accountability ordinances. A little bit more about contracting labor laws. If you would like to do business with the city or if you have a contract with the city, these are the labor laws that are required per your contract. So you should definitely stay tuned for this section. Now, for each of these laws, our staff will give you information to determine if you are a covered employer and if you have covered employees. If these two conditions are met, you need to comply with the law or laws and understand the requirements. In addition to the nuts and bolts of the labor laws, staff will also give you best practices and some information on options of compliance. The presentations today are an overview, and we highly recommend that if you must comply with any of these laws, please visit our website and review the information we have there. On our website, we have forms, posters in 5 languages, answers to frequently asked questions, sample forms, handouts, and lots more. If you would like access to more webinars and trainings, we also have a dedicated section on our website so that you can go through more on-demand webinars and trainings. At the conclusion of each presentation, we will provide specific information on how to contact each unit, such as telephone numbers, email addresses, and website links. There's a lot of information that we'll cover today, and we welcome your questions. If you have any, please send them to the email address, and we will answer your questions. There also will be a live question and answer session at the very end of our presentation, where our presenters will answer your questions live. And as a reminder, you're always welcome to contact us after the webinar to get personalized assistance via telephone or email. Next slide, please. So let's get started with our citywide labor laws that all businesses operating in the city and county of San Francisco need to understand and comply with if required. To present on the San Francisco minimum wage and paid sick leave ordinances, I'd like to hand it off to my colleague, Lin Xiao Chin. Hi, Lin Xiao.
Thanks, Beverly, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Next slide, please. So the current San Francisco minimum wage is $16.32 per hour, and the minimum wage is adjusted every July 1st based on changes in the consumer price index. We do often get calls for information on updated wage rates for budget projections. The rate is updated on our website in May. Next slide, please. If you have any questions, we do have a multilingual hotline that we answer live. So please feel free to give us a call or email us or go to our website to find the posters. Next slide, please. So now I'm gonna go over San Francisco's paid sick leave ordinance. Next slide. My colleague Beverly will be doing a presentation on the minimum compensation ordinance later, and she will go over how the paid sick leave ordinance is integrated into the paid time off requirements under the MCO. In terms of covered employees for the San Francisco paid sick leave ordinance, that is employees who work 56 or more hours per year in San Francisco. This includes part-time, temporary, and full-time employees, regardless of where the company is located, as long as the employee is working in San Francisco for 56 or more hours, they are covered. Next slide, please. So employees use sick leave when they are ill, injured, or receiving medical treatment or diagnosis. Sick leave can also be used to care for the following family members: child, parent, guardian, sibling, grandparent, grandchild, spouse, or a registered domestic partner. Also, employees should have the opportunity to fill out a designated person form. That is one person that they may designate that they can provide care for. Many companies opt to provide this form along with the annual open enrollment package, but the form should be offered to new employees upon hire. Sick leave can also be used by an employee who's a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. Next slide. Paid sick leave accrues 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. The accrual starts on day 1 of employment, and the employee may use the hours accrued after 90 days. The caps on the accrual for companies with less than 10 employees, the accrual cap is 40 hours at a time. For larger companies with 10 or more employees, the accrual cap is 72 hours. Next slide. It's important to understand that the caps are not annual, and so those 40 and 72 hour caps are at any given time an employee may have that number of hours accrued. So for payroll purposes, what that means is that the accrued hours carry over from year to year. Employers must notify employees how many sick leave hours they have accrued each pay period. So that may be on a pay stub or as an attachment. Employees can use any paid sick leave accrued. So there is no limit. As long as the employee has those hours in their bank, they are entitled to use those sick leave hours. Next slide. If you have any questions, our hotline is answered during normal business hours, so feel free to get in touch with us. Next slide. The third and last ordinance that I'm going to go over today is the COVID-related employment protections ordinance. Next slide. So this employment protections ordinance was originally passed as an emergency ordinance. It was then extended, and it was passed as a regular ordinance, which expires on March 6, 2023. Next slide. So who is covered? Employees, both part-time and temporary employees are also included, and employees or independent contractors who perform at least 16 hours of work. Next slide. So this law protects workers who have tested positive for COVID-19 or who may be quarantining or have had exposure. This law provides protection for the worker who is unable to attend work. It does not matter if the worker is eligible or is taking whether paid or unpaid leave under any other employee benefit programs or under any other state or federal laws. The San Francisco ordinance provides protection for these employees. Next slide. So employers may not rescind an offer to employ a new employee if they are impacted by COVID-19. If a new employee is unable to start work because they have either tested positive or are quarantined or were exposed, then the employer should accommodate the applicant by scheduling a later start date if where it is reasonably feasible. Next slide. So while I gave just a very general overview of this ordinance, if you do have very specific or individual questions, please feel free to reach out to us and we can talk that through with you. And that will conclude my presentation. Thank you. Next slide. And so we will have Maura Prendeville to talk about the healthcare security ordinance.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here this morning. Sorry, I think I had an echo there. My name is Maura Prendeville. I supervise the healthcare security ordinance team at OLSE. Next slide. So the healthcare security ordinance, also known as the Hcso, has been in effect since 2008. So this is not a new law. As a business owner, hopefully this is just a review for you and not news. And if it is brand new information for you, please don't panic. You can contact our office and we can talk about how to get you into compliance if this is new for you. And excuse me, I'm trying to fix my video here. There we go. So the Hcso requires covered employers to spend money on healthcare services on behalf of their covered employees. Covered employers are businesses that have 20 or more employees worldwide. That does not mean 20 employees in San Francisco. It means 20 worldwide. So you could have 19 employees in San Mateo and 1 employee in San Francisco. You would be a covered employer. An important thing to note for this group is this law does not only apply to city contractors. This applies to all businesses in San Francisco. And again, that minimum size threshold is based on the overall number of employees globally. Next slide, please. So most businesses here are going to be covered by this law. If you've got 20 or more employees, your next step is to determine which of your employees are covered by the Hcso. So it's a pretty simple threshold for employees. They need to have been covered by the, they need to have been employed by the company for at least 90 calendar days and work at least 8 hours per week in San Francisco. So that's going to cover the bulk of your workforce. It's a pretty broad definition. So just some key things to remember. Whether or not the employee already has health insurance does not matter. Whether the employee is eligible for company benefits does not matter. Whether the employee is full-time, part-time, temporary, seasonal, unionized, not unionized, doesn't matter. There are very, very limited exemptions for this law. So what you want to do is basically assume that all of your employees are going to be covered by this law as long as they've worked at least 8 hours a week in San Francisco on average and are employed for at least 90 days. Next slide, please. One exemption that is worth speaking about with this group is, I just want to point out there is another healthcare law that's going to be addressed later in the presentation that applies only to city contractors. That one is called the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance, or the Hcso. So it can be a little bit confusing because if you do have a city contract and you have people working in San Francisco, it's possible that as the employer, you could be covered by both laws. So you could be required to satisfy the requirements of the Hcso for your employees that are working in on the city contract. And you may have employees that are not working on the city contract, but are working in San Francisco, and they're covered by default by the Hcso, the Healthcare Security Ordinance. So, and I'm sorry, I realize there's a typo on this slide here. But basically an employer might be covered by both healthcare laws, but any individual employee will only be covered by one or the other of them. And this is going to be discussed in more detail later on, but I do want to highlight this one exemption because it's going to be most relevant to this group. Next slide, please. Okay, so you've determined you're a covered employer because you have at least 20 employees. What are your obligations under the Hcso? The first one, pretty simple. You need to have a notice up in the workplace. Every year we publish a new Hcso poster that should be up wherever you put your labor law posters. That's to advise employees of their rights. And the second one is to report to the city every year on how you complied with this law. So as I'm going to discuss later on, there are various ways to comply with the Hcso, and there's often a combination of ways to comply. So one thing that you need to do is tell the city how you've been complying, because we don't know unless you tell us or unless we audit you. I will point out that this requirement was waived because of COVID for calendar year 2019 and calendar year 2020. So this was the only time since the Hcso has been in effect that the reporting requirement was postponed because of COVID. However, we do expect that it is going to be required for calendar year 2021. So what that means is in April of 2022, you're going to report to the city, you're going to report to our office about how you complied with the spending requirement for the Hcso in 2021. And we do give a lot of webinars and trainings for employers about how to get that done. Number 3, you need to keep records. A lot of this piece is pretty basic. A lot of the records you're keeping are already required by state law, like payroll records. But you also want to make sure you keep record of any healthcare expenditures that you've made on behalf of your employees. And then the most important requirement is that you satisfy the spending requirement. So that's the one I'm going to speak about in more detail. Next slide, please. Okay, what is the spending requirement? There are 2 things that dictate how much you need to spend on employee healthcare. Number 1 is the size of the employer. So you'll see here a medium-sized employer is one that has 20 to 99 employees worldwide. A large employer has 100 or more workers worldwide. The rate changes every year, and we do have the 2022 rates available. So those are listed here. If you're doing open enrollment or you're planning for your healthcare expenses for next year, you want to keep in mind next year's rate. Now, the spending requirement has to be satisfied quarterly, but because a lot of employers comply through their health insurance plan and they pay for that monthly or they're invoiced monthly, I do have some monthly calculations here just as an example. So 2021, this year, if you're a large employer, meaning you have 100 or more workers, you should be spending $3.18 per hour. For a full-time employee, what does that look like? It looks like almost $547 per month. $1,600 in a quarter. If it's a part-time employee, it's based on the employee's hours, so it's going to be half of that. So you've got the hourly rate, which is dependent on employer size, and then the rate corresponds to the number of hours worked in San Francisco by the covered employee during that quarter. If you're a medium-sized employer, so you've got 20 employees, but you haven't hit 100, you're going to go with that medium rate of $212 per hour. That means in this current year, you should be spending around $365 a month for healthcare for full-time workers. Again, part-time workers are entitled to less. And the rates change annually, so we've got 2022 rates available here. Next slide, please. Okay, so you've got the rate based on the employer size. What you want to do is figure out how much you need to spend based on the employee's payable hours. Payable hours are any hours that the employee has worked in San Francisco, as well as hours for which the person is entitled to be paid under state or local law. So, for example, someone uses sick leave, vacation time, PTO, overtime, for example, those are all included in payable hours, but there's a cap. So the maximum you would need to spend on any one employee is 172 hours per month. So you could have someone who works a whole bunch of overtime in a month and they end up with 220 payable hours. You don't need to spend on the 220, you need to spend on the 172. And the examples I had on the previous slide were all based on the cap, so you wouldn't need to go above that. The healthcare expenditures have to be made within 30 days at the end of following the end of a quarter. So for example, quarter 3, which we just finished, July, August, and September, you've got 30 days, so until October 30th, to calculate everybody's hours, multiply it by the rate, and figure out how much you need to spend. Quarterly deadlines are listed here. So that's the deadline. You got 30 days to figure it out at the end of the quarter. You may have already spent enough, or if you haven't, then you have that 30-day period to make up the expenditures. Next slide. Okay, so how do you make the expenditures? You figured out how much you need to spend. What kinds of things can you spend it on to comply with this law? The most popular compliance option for employers is providing health insurance. So any amounts that the business spends on medical, dental, or vision premiums for employees or employees' dependents counts as a healthcare expenditure. You may be doing that anyway. So any amounts that you're spending help satisfy your requirements under this ordinance. You may contribute to the San Francisco City option. This is often, many people refer to it as Healthy San Francisco, which is not completely accurate. It's kind of a misnomer. But the San Francisco City option program is run by the Department of Public Health. If you, as an employer, put money into the city option program on behalf of your employees, those employees will get an individual MRA, a medical reimbursement account, that they can use with their for their own out-of-pocket medical expenses. They can use it to pay for premiums if they're paying for their own insurance. They can use it for a wide variety of medical, dental, and vision expenses for themselves and their dependents. So it's a pretty popular program. Employers can also contribute to HSAs, health savings accounts, medical savings accounts, or other types of irrevocable reimbursement accounts. And it's pretty common for employers to use a combination of these options in order to comply with the law. So for example, maybe you're a medium-sized employer, and so you have to spend that $212 per hour, and all your employees are full-time. So you need to spend around $365 a month on some sort of healthcare expenditure. Maybe you're only spending $200 a month on health insurance. That $200 a month counts, but you need to do more. So you may do a combination of health insurance and then additional payments into the city option program so that you can get to that full dollar amount that you're supposed to spend. Because having insurance alone is not enough. The insurance has to be sufficiently expensive to comply with this ordinance. Oftentimes it's not, and so employers will need to top off those payments. Another popular combination is health insurance with HSA contributions. So maybe the insurance plan is not expensive enough to comply with the Hcso. The employer can top it off with HSA contributions. Another way that employers combine these options is there may be different ways to comply for different populations within your employee group. So you may have a group of people who get health insurance through the company, and you've already looked at it and assessed that it is sufficient to comply with the law. So you're spending enough on insurance for the people that have it. You may have a big group of part-time employees that aren't eligible for the company's health plan, and you may want to do city option payments for that group of people. So it's pretty common to have a combination of different options for any one individual employee, or for groups of employees, you may comply in different ways. Next slide. And so some common compliance issues that we've seen over the years from speaking with employees over the phone and with employers, failing to make healthcare expenditures at all. If that's you, please contact us so we can help get you into compliance and address any past violations. It's always better for you to call us than for us to audit you or get a complaint from one of your employees. So if you're realizing that this is the first time you've heard about this law and you haven't been in compliance, please call us. It's much better. We don't penalize anyone for contacting us with questions. Another common compliance issue is spending too little. So some employers think, well, I provide insurance, that's enough. As I stated earlier, that's not necessarily enough, because the amount that you're spending is what we're looking for in terms of compliance with this law. So you could be providing insurance to everybody, but the plan is too cheap to satisfy that rate, either the $212 per hour or the $318 per hour. Forgetting part-time employees or other people who are not eligible for the company's health plan. So again, this law applies to people who work 8 or more hours a week in San Francisco. If you have a health plan where it doesn't kick in until someone's working 30 hours a week, you might be missing a whole group of employees who are still covered by the law, but not eligible for your company's benefits. So missing part-time workers is a big, a common violation And then another one that people miss sometimes is failing to make healthcare expenditures for employees with other coverage. So again, as I stated earlier, the employee's insurance status does not matter. If they've worked at least 8 hours a week and they've worked for 90 days, they're covered by the law. Maybe they already have health insurance through their spouse. Maybe they already have it through their other job. Maybe they're on Medi-Cal. Doesn't matter. They're still covered. So just because somebody maybe is eligible for your insurance and declines it because they already have coverage, they're still covered by the Hcso and they're still entitled to an expenditure. In that situation, we would probably advise that the employer makes city option contributions for them, which they can use to offset the cost of their premiums or any other out-of-pocket expenses. So look out for that group of people. Next slide. And again, there are some nuances here. I'm just doing a general overview, but what I want to stress is that if you realize you have some compliance problems or there's something here that's not clear, please check out our website. Please contact our hotline. We have multiple languages on our hotline. And again, we don't penalize employers for contacting us with questions. If you have some violations, we can talk to you about how to fix them. You should not be afraid to call. And then we do have more trainings. We give trainings on reporting forms. We actually give trainings every month with the city option program about how to comply and what the benefits are for employees. And then I'd say sign up for our updates on our email list because we do have periodic changes. For example, the expenditure rate changes every year. And then if there are any other updates, we send them out through our email listserv. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to the next speaker. I believe it's Bernice Casey. Thank you.
Bernice, we can't hear you.
Problems with my sound. Thank you very much, Lin Chow. Can you hear me now? Great.
Loud and clear, Bernice.
Thank you. I apologize. What I was saying while I was muted is, if you have questions about any of the information that's been presented thus far from Beverly, from Lin Chow, or from Maura, just a reminder that you should email your questions to cityadmin.events@sfgov.org. Again, if you have questions about the presentation thus far, please email your questions to cityadmin.events@sfgov.org. I'm going to give a presentation today about the Paid Parental Leave Ordinance. Next slide, please. The Paid Parental Leave Ordinance, also referred to as the PPLO, is the only law of its kind in the United States. It was passed in 2016 by the Board of Supervisors, and our office began implementing the law on January 1st, 2017. The law requires that employers of a certain size provide compensation to employees who are receiving the state of California's paid family leave benefit for the purposes of bonding with a new child. Next slide, please. Want to talk first about which of the employers who have businesses in San Francisco and employees in San Francisco are covered by the law. So this law applies only to private employers, government agencies such as the City and County of San Francisco, State of California agencies, and federal agencies are not covered by the law. So if you're a private employer that has 20 or more employees globally, so even if you only have 2 employees working in San Francisco and the rest of your workforce is working in Alameda County, that you have 25 people in Alameda County, 2 in San Francisco, as long as you have 20 or more globally, you're covered under this law. If you have a fluctuating workforce, so perhaps you have a seasonal workforce in which you have more people employed during the summer months, if you have this fluctuation, you would do a look back at certain time periods to determine if you met the 20 employee count threshold. Our office can help you with that, and we'll talk about that look back period later on in our presentation. You are required as a covered employer to ensure that you have notices about the paid parental leave ordinance up in a conspicuous place for your workforce. If you have a virtual office, or if your San Francisco employees don't report to a brick or mortar location, you are still required to ensure that they receive a copy of any current notice or any future notice. So for those of you who have an employee portal, you can upload the document. If you don't have an employee portal, you can email the document, or you can provide a mailed copy. But however you ensure the notice is posted, whether it's posted in a physical location or you provide it through a portal or through mail, you want to keep a record of when you made that notice available to your employees. Thank you. Next slide, please. So who's covered by the law? To be covered by the law, you have to be performing work in San Francisco. If you had a business prior to the shelter in place order in which people came into your business in San Francisco, but now are working from home and their home is outside San Francisco, those individuals are no longer working in San Francisco and therefore not covered by the law. You have to be employed for at least 180 days with the employer. What's important to note about that 180-day threshold is the paid parental leave ordinance does not require the same amount of employment as laws such as the California Family Rights Act or the Family Medical Leave Act. So as an employer, you want to ensure that anyone who has worked for you for 6 months, if they become a parent during that time, you need to understand that they are covered by this law. For employees that are part-time, you want to make sure that they work an average of 8 hours within the look-back period. And again, we will talk about what the look-back period entails at a later time. For people who are salaried, who work in different locations for you, you want to ensure that they've worked at least 40% of the time in San Francisco. And then it's important to understand that for an employee to be covered by this law, they need to be in receipt of paid family leave bonding benefit. So what that means is that you as an employer have other requirements under state law to notify employees of their eligibility for benefits administered through the California Department of Employment. Sorry, let's try that again. Through the state of California's Employment Development Department. So once an employee notifies you that they're going to be a parent, you are required to provide them EDD paperwork. Once an employee applies for and begins to receive the paid family leave benefit for purposes of bonding with a new child, that is one of the criteria that establishes their eligibility for supplemental compensation through you. Next slide, please. So In the previous two slides, I talked about the look back period. So the look back period is the time prior to someone applying for paid family leave. So if you run payroll each week, that means you're going to look back at the 12 weeks prior to the individual who applied for paid family leave. If you run payroll semi-monthly or bi-weekly, the look back period are the 6 pay periods prior to leave. And if you run payroll monthly, you're going to look back at the 3 monthly periods. This time, this PPL look back period is used to determine eligibility. So again, if you have a fluctuating workforce and your workforce was an average of 8 employees for 3 weeks and 45 employees for 3 weeks, then you would have more than 20 employees within that 6-week look back period. And as such, you would be covered under the law. The reverse would be true, right? If you had an average of 20 employees for 3 weeks during this, sorry, I'm misspeaking. If you had 20 employees during half of the 6 biweekly pay periods, and you had 8 employees for the other half of the 6 biweekly pay periods, the average would be less than 20, and then you would not be covered under the law. The look back period is also used to determine the normal gross weekly wage. For some of you who've never applied this benefit for your employees, it can be confusing. So you should feel free to reach out to our office at any time if you have questions in how to determine if you are covered by the law based on employee count fluctuation. And if you need assistance determining what your employee's normal gross weekly wage is when you're applying this look back period. Next slide, please. So on our website, you'll find multiple tools for both employees and employers. One of the easier things for employers is the step-by-step guide. So this gives you a really concise way of ensuring that you are complying with the law. So one of the first things you're required to do is post the notice. So it tells you how to do that. The next is to ensure that you're giving any individual who tells you they're going to be a parent the San Francisco paid parental leave form, and that you're keeping a record of that so that if at a later time an employee says they never received it, you would be able to look in your records and determine that, yes, you did provide that form on October 1st, 2021. And then once you receive the completed form back from the employee, you're going to utilize that information to determine their eligibility and then to move forward and calculate any compensation that employee is owed. This information, the step-by-step guide, is found on our website. Next slide, please. There's also a step-by-step guide for employees. And what I suggest, although not required by the law, is to provide the step-by-step form to your employees when your employees tell you that they're going to be a parent, that you're providing them the PPO form and the step-by-step guide. All of the guides on our website for both employees and employers are listed in multiple languages. You'll find them in English as they appear on the slides, in Spanish, and in Chinese. So the steps for the employees are to apply for paid family leave through the EDD, which they can do online or through paper form. They need to complete the San Francisco paid parental leave form after they've made that application to the EDD and it's been approved. Then they submit their completed San Francisco form and the notice of computation to the employer. So the notice of computation is basically the document that is sent to the employee. It is not sent to the employer. It's sent to the employee, and it tells the employee how much their award from the state of California is going to be. It gives them a total award amount and a weekly award amount, as well as a daily award amount. As an employer, you will need that weekly award amount from the EDD. The employee, when they complete their PPLO form, within the form, they can either attach the notice of computation, or they can indicate on the form that they've given you, the employer, permission to contact the EDD on their behalf. We're going to talk about that, the contacting the EDD part, in future slides. Next slide, please. So paid family leave, although our law, the Paid Parental Leave Ordinance, has been in effect since January 1st, 2017, prior to July 1st, 2020, paid family leave was 6 weeks. However, since July 1st, 2020, all individuals who apply for paid family leave are eligible for 8 weeks of wage replacement through the state of California. There are 2 separate paid family leave benefits administered through the EDD. One is to care for an ill family member. That benefit is referred to as PFL caregiving. And the other benefit is the bonding benefit. And so again, you can utilize the paid family leave bonding to bond with a newborn child born to you, to bond with a newly adopted child, or to bond with a foster child. And it is that second benefit, paid family leave bonding, that the PPLO applies to. So if someone's receiving paid family leave caregiving, the San Francisco law, the Paid Parental Leave Ordinance, does not apply. It only applies to people who are receiving paid family leave for the purposes of bonding. The benefit from the state of California varies, and it is dependent on income. Some employees will receive 60% of their regular wages, others 70%. But please bear in mind that the state of California has a cap. So for example, for high wage earners, the current cap from the state of California is $13.57. So if someone is making $4,000 a week or $3,000 a week, the 60 to 70% is not applicable there. So it's important, again, depending on your workforce, to understand that the benefit that comes from the state is dependent on wages. However, there is a cap imposed. Please note that if you have 2 parents working for you, if you have a couple who are parents to the same child working for you, both of those parents can take paid family leave. It's important to note that paid family leave as a wage replacement benefit can be taken consecutively, meaning 8 weeks in a row, or the benefit can be taken intermittently, meaning you could take 3 weeks up front and then as an employee choose to take the remainder 5 weeks in a different time period. If you have any questions about paid family leave, please call the employer number. The number on this slide is not published on the EDD website. I cannot make a guarantee that you will get to the EDD quickly, but it is important that you note this number: 855-342-3645. Thank you. Next slide, please. So how, as an employer, do you determine the amount of compensation that is owed to your employee? How do you figure out what you need to pay someone? So while your requirement is to provide the PPLO form to the employee and keep a record of when you provided it, Now what you're doing is waiting, and you're waiting for the employee to return it to you, because you as an employer can't determine the amount of money owed, the amount of compensation owed, until you know how much that employee is receiving from the state. So one of the examples that I've provided here is if the employee is receiving $1,000 a week, that's their normal salary wages from you. Then with that wage, we can say that the EDD will replace $700, which means that your portion as the employer is $300. And that total is $2,400 for all 8 weeks. Once you, the employer, receive that completed San Francisco form with proof that the employee is receiving the EDD benefit, you will need to begin to pay the supplemental compensation at the next regularly scheduled pay period. I apologize that the cap reflected on the slide is for 2020. I will change that and provide the 2021 cap. Thank you. Go ahead, please, and show the next slide. So here are some common compliance issues that come up. These are based on calls that we receive from both employees and employers. So it's important that you as It's important for you as an employer to maintain accurate records. So as soon as someone tells you they're going to be a parent, you want to make sure that you provide them that San Francisco paid parental leave form. You keep a record of when you provided it. Some people tell you they're going to be a parent when they're 6 weeks pregnant. Some people tell you they're going to be a parent when they're on the way to the courthouse to finalize their adoption, right? So people tell you as their employer when they're going to become a parent at different times. So again, your obligation is to maintain records that demonstrate that as soon as you found out that person was going to be a parent, that you provided them the form. So some confusion about the law is people believe mistakenly that the paid parental leave ordinance only applies to pregnant people. The law applies to all parents, regardless if they gave birth or not. The law applies to everyone who has become a parent. Again, as I said previously regarding paid family leave, people can take their paid family leave benefit intermittently, meaning they don't have to take it all at once. And if that is how an employee is taking their state of California benefit, it's your obligation as an employer to provide that compensation intermittently as well. I think I talked about this before, but again, want to really emphasize the PPLO covers people who have been employed with you for 180 days, does not have the same employment requirements as the California Family Rights Act or the Family Medical Leave Act. Next slide, please. If you have an employee handbook or an employee portal, make sure you've updated it about the paid parental leave ordinance. By that, I mean that there's information in there about the San Francisco law, that there's information about when you provide the paid parental leave form to people and how they can follow up with you, the employer, if they have questions about their supplemental compensation. If you have a workforce that is predominantly Spanish speaking, that means that every time a Spanish speaking employee asks you about becoming a parent, you're going to provide them the PPLO form in that language. So again, remember, there are multiple forms on our website. When I say our website, of course, the Office of Labor Standards Enforcement, but I'm talking specifically here about the section of that website that has information about the paid parental leave ordinance. All of the forms are in at least 3 languages, and you want to make sure that you give the form to the employee in the language that they can best receive the information. Make sure you keep a record of when you gave it and when it was returned to you. Make sure that you're in communication with employees before, during, and after leave to ensure that your records show that you've made the employee aware of their obligations as well, meaning that they need to return the form to you. Maintain all EDD records that you receive and all payroll records so that you, if needed, could demonstrate that you provided the appropriate amount of compensation. There are calculation instructions on our website. There are both Excel documents that walk you through calculations, as well as PDFs that give you more narrative on how to determine the amount of compensation owed. Please make sure that you're paying employees at the regular scheduled pay period. And if you have any questions about this presentation or about future questions regarding parents going out on leave, please feel free to contact our office. Next slide, please. The information you will find on our website, we do have the official notice. You can print it off directly from the website. If you'd like colored copies, please reach out to our office and we can put them in the mail to you. You will find information about trainings that have been provided in the past about the PPLO, the calculators and the instructions that I spoke about. There is also information about the law itself, the rules governing the law, and we've put together a couple pages of frequently asked questions. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. And I believe our next speaker is Beverly Popek.
Thank you, Bernice. Well, we're going to get into the family-friendly workplace ordinance. My name is Beverly Popek. I'm one of the supervising compliance officers here at OLSC. Next slide, please. So when does this ordinance apply? It applies to employers who have 20 employees or more anywhere in the world. It doesn't matter where you're headquartered. If you have 20 or more employees, you're covered under this law. The next question to figure out is, do you have any employees that are covered under this law? So let's look at this. Number one, you may have covered employees who work within San Francisco and they would be covered, but they have to work at least 8 hours a week and they have to be employed for at least 6 months or more. So that's the information of who is indeed a covered employee. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the overview of the family-friendly workplace ordinance. This law grants workers the right to request a flexible or predictable work arrangement to help with family caregiving obligations without fear of retaliation. You as an employer can deny the request, but it would be only for bona fide business reasons that you will need to explain in writing. The family-friendly workplace ordinance has a process. I think of it as a process law, and there's details to it. So we're going to get into this in our next couple of slides. Next slide, please. Before we do, I really want to define caregiving. So caregiving can be for children or a child in which the employee has parental responsibility. It could be for a person that the employee has to care for, which they have a serious health condition in the family. And it could be, of course, the employee's parent, age 65 or older. Next slide, please. So the employee does have rights, and the rights include, but is not limited to, request changes for the following. So they can request perhaps the number of hours they'd like to work, times worked, work location, work assignments, as well as requesting a predictability of work schedule so they can manage their caregiving responsibilities. Next slide, please. You as an employer have to respond, and this is really what you have to do. So after receiving a request from an employee, you need to meet with the employee within 21 days. I always tell employers to have perhaps a form when making this request, but please note that if someone is making the request verbally, this does count. So please meet with the employee within 21 days, and at that meeting, hear and understand what they're requesting. And then after that meeting, you consider the request and you need to respond within 21 days of that meeting. So 21 days is the key here. It doesn't have to be 21 days. Sooner is better than 21 days, because if your employee is trying to care for someone, the faster you respond, I think the better off everybody will be. Now, you as an employer may grant or you may deny the request. So let's go into how you how you need to deny the request if that is what you'd like to do. You need to explain to the employee in writing a bona fide business reason or reasons for the denial. And when you give that information to the employee, it needs to be in writing, and you also have to notify that employee that they have a right to request a reconsideration. Perhaps there's other information that wasn't shared at the meeting, or maybe they gave you some paperwork, but you need to let them know that they do have a right to request a reconsideration. Next slide, please. This is an excellent process diagram of the right to a process and what you need to look at. The employee makes a request, and within 21 days or less, you need to meet with the employee. After that meeting, within 21 days or less, you need to provide some sort of written response. On the left-hand side, if you grant the request, I do recommend you put things in writing when it was granted, et cetera, et cetera. But if you do not want to grant the request, if you want to deny the request, look on the right-hand side, and you need to provide a bona fide business reason why the request is denied. And you need to also let the employee know that they may request a reconsideration. You should put that in writing in your letter. Next slide, please. Here is the contact information for our unit, the Family Friendly Workplace Ordinance. On this web page as well, you will find sample request forms and the require notice to employees about this particular ordinance. Feel free to contact us directly via email or at our helpline listed here. Next slide, please. Now we're moving on to lactation accommodation in the workplace. Next slide, please. Let's get into a little bit about the history regarding this particular law. The purpose of the Lactation in the Workplace Ordinance was to provide a supportive work environment to enable employees who are nursing to breastfeed or express milk during work hours. This amended the police code and the San Francisco building code so that we have local standards here in San Francisco to complement already existing state and federal laws to support lactation in the workplace. Next slide, please. So who's covered? All employers, all businesses, except for government entities in San Francisco that have employees working in San Francisco are covered. So it's a simple definition of who's covered. Now, are employees covered? All employees are covered, actually, working in the geographic boundaries of San Francisco. And these people do include part-time employees. There's no threshold or waiting periods or anything like that. Next slide, please. Now that we understand who's covered, let's get into some of the requirements about lactation breaks. So as an employer, you must provide a reasonable amount of break time for employees to express breast milk. Now, reasonable amount of time, that is something that you will have to really find out from the person. What is reasonable for one person may be unreasonable or totally impossible for another. So this process is really, we always tell employers that you need to communicate regularly with the employee to understand and to coordinate things. So figure out what is that reasonable amount of time, and the break time if possible, can run concurrently with any break time that you already provide the employee. But sometimes it's not possible. So if there are break times that don't run concurrently with the rest of the time, it's already authorized under the state law that it may be unpaid. But please make it clear to the employee so everybody understands what's happening. Next slide, please. So once you have a schedule going, that could be set between you and the employee that's worked out, because maybe there's backup and there's coverage that's needed. Please make it clear that it's a relationship. Communication needs to happen. So if there's any changes that need to happen, the employee should contact you and talk to you. So let's take a look at the lactation location. You need to provide a location for lactation other than a bathroom. A bathroom is not acceptable and it's a violation. And that particular location needs to be in close proximity to the employee's work area. And there's some more information about that. So that area needs to be shielded from view and free from intrusion. It needs to be safe and clean, contains a surface, has a place to sit, and has access to electricity. A little tip about the electricity, we're here in San Francisco, and sometimes we are very adaptable as we are. If the room doesn't have a socket for electricity, you can provide, some sort of plug or extension cord, but you have to just have access to electricity in that room. So in addition to having that room, you must provide access that's close to the employee's work area, a refrigerator and sink with running water. Those two items, refrigerator and sink with running water, it does not have to be in that lactation room, but if it is, great. Now, if you're sharing, office, if you're in a multi-tenant building, you can have a shared location if you don't have that space within. So that is compliant. Next slide, please. The next part about the lactation accommodation is a requirement to have a policy. You need to develop and implement a policy that affirms the employee's right to lactation, and so that they understand if they would like to do this, what should they do? Number one, how can they submit a request? Now, if someone does submit a request, you need to respond within 5 business days. And then the third point is that the employer, you as the employer and the employee, must engage in that interactive process to determine the appropriate lactation break periods and, of course, location. The best thing to do is that once you have this policy, and every business in San Francisco needs to have this policy, it's a requirement under the law, you should put this into your employee handbook, distribute it, make it readily available for anyone who is a parent. Next slide, please. This last slide gives us some direct contact information for the lactation in the workplace, resources, as well as our unit. On our website, you will find a document with frequently asked questions and, of course, some answers. We also have a sample employer policy in Word, in which you can download and use and modify to make it your own, and as well as a request form. This is our direct unit number, phone number to contact us, and our email address. I highly recommend that if you do not have a policy, you need to look into this right away and have it available. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact us. Thank you. Next slide.
All right. Thank you so much to Beverly, Linshao, Maura, and Bernice. We really appreciate all the great information that you've shared. This is going to be our first break for questions, and we've gotten quite a few questions on the material that you've presented so far. A reminder to our audience, if you have questions in your mind right now, please email them over to cityadmin.events@sfgov.org, and we will circulate those over to our speakers. We'll get to as many as we can during this brief break for questions right now. So I'm going to dive right in, and I'll try to organize these questions by the laws that they pertain to. So the first questions coming in are around the healthcare security ordinance. First question we received is, how would I know if my insurance plan complies?
Hey, Nicole, I'll take that one. Maura Prendeville here again. You have to look at the cost of the insurance compared to how much you're required to spend. If you're a medium-sized employer and you're looking at spending $2.12 an hour, for a full-time employee, that's $365 a month. So if you've got an insurance plan that costs $600 a month for that employee and you're paying the full amount, you're compliant. If you've got an insurance plan that costs $400 a month and you're paying for less than half of that, you're paying for half of that, it's not going to be sufficient. So what you need to do is look at your rate, the number of hours that your covered employees are working, and then how much the employer's share of cost is for the insurance. So a lot of employers have plans where they're paying 80% of the premium or 50% of the premium. That's going to impact whether or not your plan is compliant. There's nothing in the healthcare security ordinance that prohibits employees from paying towards the cost of their insurance, but that doesn't count as an employer spend. So you look only at the employer's percentage of the insurance. There is a way to average the monthly cost over your employee base. I'm not going to get into that on this call, but there are some instructions on our website about how to take an average cost for employees that are within one health plan.
Great.
Any more questions?
Yeah, a couple more for you on the healthcare security ordinance. Second question that came in on this one is, are there any waivers for this law?
There are. I didn't cover it because it does cause confusion. In very, very limited situations, an employer may ask, but not require, that an employee sign a waiver. So the only time an employee can waive their rights under the healthcare security ordinance is one, if they have coverage from another employer. So what that means is they have insurance from their other job or from their spouse's job, not Medi-Cal, because that's not from an employer. But if they have another job or a spouse's job who's covering their insurance, then they may be eligible to sign a waiver. However, they don't have to. They also have to understand that they're waiving their rights to an alternate expenditure. So they're saying, I have my own health coverage from another employer, and I don't want an MRA or a city option contribution. So you can imagine that does not happen very frequently. We see them every once in a while, but it is a common compliance problem for employers to just say, I don't want to have to do anything other than my insurance plan. I'm going to ask everyone to sign a waiver, and that can get you into trouble in an audit because many of those waivers will not be valid. So I'd say that in a large workforce, we may see a few valid waivers, but they're uncommon.
Perfect. Thanks for letting us know, Maura. And the last question is just clarifying requirements here. The question is, in regards to employer spending requirements, what requirements exist for employers with 19 employees or less? Specifically, in this case, Tanya has 10 employees.
So the healthcare security ordinance does not apply to employers who have fewer than 20 employees. So if you've got 19 or if you've got 10, you don't need to worry about this law at all. It's good to be aware of it because if your business grows and you get to that 20, then you do want to be cognizant that it's going to kick in. But until you're at that 20 mark, it's not going to apply. However, if you have a city contract, there may be another healthcare law that will kick in. So that'll be covered later in the presentation. But this healthcare law, the Hcso, will not apply until you hit 20.
Perfect.
That means there's no spending requirement if you're not covered by the law.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that, Maura. So the next couple questions are related to the paid parental leave ordinance. First question, does an employee have to be covered by Cfra to be eligible for paid parental leave?
Thank you very much for the question. No, the paid parental leave ordinance applies to your workers who have been employed with you for 180 days, so 6 months. Anybody who's been employed for 6 months when their paid family leave starts for the purposes of bonding, that individual is covered by the law and you're required to provide them compensation.
Okay, thank you, Bernice. Next question on paid parental leave is, can my employee take PPLO once a week?
Sure. So the PPLO is not a leave benefit in and of itself. It follows when someone is taking paid family leave. So our office as a county agency, we don't enforce that. So if you have questions about how often someone can take paid family leave, the increments, for example, in the question once a week, I believe the answer is yes, but the agency that you would need to contact is the Employment Development Department. For purposes of the paid parental leave ordinance, what you want to make sure is happening is for whichever increment your employee is taking paid family leave, that you're providing the compensation for each of those increments. And if you have additional questions about how to contact the state of California, or questions about once someone is taking intermittent leave, what you need to do, you can follow up with our office. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Bernice. The last question that we have in the queue so far is for Beverly on the family-friendly workplace ordinance. So this one, Beverly, are employers required to accommodate the request made by their employees?
No, employees have a right to request, and you as the employer must respond in a timely basis. Remember the 21 days or less. Yes, you have the option of declining, but if you deny the request, you need to put that denial in writing and state the bona fide business reason or reasons in which you've declined it. There's also some other things, and I would say, please go to our family-friendly workplace webpage. We have some sample request forms, and the process is also laid out there. And if you have any further questions, you're more than welcome to contact our unit directly.
Got it. Thank you, Beverly. And it looks like this is all the questions that have come in up till now, so we can turn back over to the second segment of your presentation.
Perfect. So hello, everyone. We are now on part 2 of our presentation. We're moving on to citywide and contracting labor laws. In this section, we will present on the Fair Chance and Salary History Ordinances, the 2 labor laws that apply citywide and are also required if you have contracts with the city and county of San Francisco. Then we will share information about prevailing wage. Now, prevailing wage are labor requirements that are job specific. So for example, prevailing wage would apply to security guards or construction workers on public works projects. Then we will conclude the morning with the minimum compensation and healthcare accountability ordinances. These 2 ordinances are for all other types of jobs or positions not covered under prevailing wage, for example, professional services. A little bit more about the contracting labor laws. If you would like to do business with the city and county of San Francisco, or if you already have a contract or contracts, these are the labor laws that's required per your contract. As a reminder, you must understand these requirements to project, budget, and manage your business costs. And also, if you are bidding and proposing with the city, you must factor in the cost of compliance into your proposal. Like before, for each law, we will give you information to determine if you are a covered employer and if you have any covered employees. If these 2 conditions are met, you will need to comply with the law or laws and understand the requirements. In addition to the nuts and bolts of the labor laws, staff will give you best practices and some options on compliance. The presentations are an overview, and we highly recommend that if you must comply with any of the laws please visit our website and review the information we have. Next slide, please. So we're going to start it off with the Fair Chance Ordinance. Next slide. So who's covered under the Fair Chance Ordinance? Employers citywide, if you don't have a contract, you're just operating in the city and county of San Francisco. If you have 5 or more employees anywhere in the world, you are covered. And then in terms of employees, any of your employees or planned positions, if you're going to hire positions in San Francisco, would be covered under this law. Now, drilling down a little bit more about the employees and these positions, it would be any position where the employee will work or works at least 8 hours a week in San Francisco. I want to remind everyone that this can be, of course, in the traditional brick and mortar sense of a store or an office in San Francisco. But if you have workers or employees working from home and they live in the city and county of San Francisco, and that's where they're working, these laws also pertain to them. So that's information about who's covered if you're just like a citywide employer. Now, if you have a contract with the city and county of San Francisco, or if you're going to bid on something, this is the information for you in regards to who is covered. So any size, if you're an employer of any size, one person, owner, operator, etc., you are covered under this law. And any of your employees or planned positions in San Francisco. So again, the positions that the employee works will have to work at least 8 hours a week in San Francisco. Next slide, please. So I think the most common question I always hear about this particular ordinance is, what is it all about? And I think this phrase, compliant hiring process, it's a process law. There's a lot of details that employers have to understand about hiring people. So think about this and keep this in mind that it is a process law. And this information is to help you understand what this process is. Next slide. So kicking it off, you have a job. And you're going to have a job announcement, usually online. One of the requirements of the Fair Chance Ordinance is that you cannot say that anyone with arrests or convictions will not be considered, or that a background check must be passed. You can't have that in your job announcements. Announcements must also include information about compliance with the Fair Chance Ordinance. At the very bottom of the screen, bold and italicized, this is the sentence that is compliant. You can go to our Fair Chance Ordinance webpage and take this information at a later date to put into your job announcements. If there's an inquiry or any questions, we will look at your job announcements, and you need to have this statement in there. Next slide, please. Okay, once you have the announcement out there, take a look at your job applications. The job applications cannot ask about the applicant's history of arrests or convictions. There cannot be a box where it says, hey, check off this box if you've ever been arrested or convicted of a crime. You can't have that. So be careful. A lot of times you're using application forms that are out there on the internet. Double check that it is in compliance with the San Francisco Fair Chance Ordinance. The second point about this is that employers cannot ask or inquire into convictions or unresolved arrests until after a conditional offer of employment is made. So drilling this down, you can't ask about it until after a conditional offer of employment is made. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about this law, that you can never ever, but it can be done, but only, of course, until after a conditional offer of employment is made. Next slide. So here is a nice little step-by-step overview of this compliant hiring process for this law. As mentioned before, job postings must include that compliance statement. Go to our website and get that statement on your job announcements. Number two, There is no must-pass background or questions asking about a background check until after a conditional offer of employment is made. Number 3, after a conditional offer of employment is made, you can conduct a background check. But if something comes back on the background check, there are no automatic rejections of saying, oh, you can't be hired, or I'm not hiring this person. Next slide, please. So more into revoking the job offer. So if you plan to revoke the job offer after you receive the background check and the report, you must conduct an individualized assessment and provide the preliminary decision to the applicant about why you are not hiring them anymore. Now, when you conduct this individualized assessment, you need to have this in writing. There is a form that is at the state Department of Fair Employment and Housing that you can use as a template. I would keep this form and information you use to conduct an individualized assessment on file if there are any questions. Now, when you send this information to the applicant that you are revoking the job offer, you need to put this in writing, and you need to offer the applicant 7 days to provide clarification on errors of the background check and to provide perhaps any mitigating circumstances and evidence of rehabilitation for you to consider, because the process is not over. So you send it to the applicant. They have at least 7 days, and you need to also include a copy of the background check at that time. So after you give the applicant 7 days and perhaps they send some information back, you need to conduct an individualized reassessment with the background report and any new information from the applicant to make your final decision. Next slide, please. So we've talked a lot about the background report, the background check. Now, there are prohibited information that may not be considered at any times. And people get really overwhelmed with these phrases because unless you're in the criminal justice system, these are not common things that you know the definitions of or anything like that. So what I would say is you can look up this information to look at definitions, but also look at this list to see that you cannot consider this at any time in things. So the first one is an arrest not leading to a conviction, except for unresolved arrests. The second item that should not be considered at any time is participation in a diversion or deferral of judgment program. The third item is a conviction that has been dismissed or expunged. Fourth is a conviction in the juvenile justice system. And number 5, which is most common as a violation, is that an employer has looked and considered conviction that is more than 7 years old. The background check will, depending on the parameters, may show things that are over 7 years old. And if you see that, you cannot consider it. Number 6, an offense other than a felony or misdemeanor, for example, like a traffic ticket. And number 7, any decriminalized offenses such as some cannabis convictions. So I would highly recommend that at a later date you print or have this information readily available if it's necessary, if you do indeed run a background check and something is on there. Next slide, please. So there are exceptions to the prohibited information. You can consider convictions and arrests prior to the 7-year look-back period for jobs supervising minors, dependent adults, as well as persons 65 years or older. And if you have positions or jobs where you can consider infractions, for example, someone's driving record, traffic tickets, etc., it is okay to look at those things. Please, next slide. We also have some state and federal preemptions. So we do have federal and state laws that preempt the Hcso, meaning that if you are in specific industries such as the financial services or insurance industry, the federal and state laws say that The San Francisco Fair Chance Ordinance does not apply for those industries. If you're in those industries, you probably know about it. And obviously, if you have more questions, you can contact us. Next slide, please. So what the Hcso doesn't do, we have this slide here because there's a lot of misconceptions about what it requires, what you can and can't do as an employer. So very quickly, the Hcso does not require you as an employer to give preference to or hire unqualified individuals with unresolved arrest or conviction records. It doesn't limit your ability to choose the most qualified and appropriate candidates among applicants. And it certainly does not require you to conduct a background check, nor does it prohibit you, stop you from conducting a background check. Next slide. Some common violations. Next slide. The first common violation that we see at our office is that the employer asks about convictions on job applications from the very beginning, or they refuse to hire someone because there's a conviction on the background report that's 7 years or older. Or perhaps the employer implies that no individuals with convictions will be hired, saying that a background check must be passed. These are all no-nos and common violations, so please avoid these. Next slide. Some other common violations that I'd like to share with you is that sometimes we have employers who have an improper process of notifying applicants of convictions or unresolved arrests and length of duration. So this is very important. If you are notifying the applicant after you've made a conditional job offer and you'd like to ask for more information, you need to have a proper process as we described here. So what I would do, and this is my best tip to you today, is review your process from start to finish, from the job announcements, applications, and everything, and see where is compliant and where it's not. And if you're unsure, because this can be very overwhelming, you can always contact our office, make an appointment, and review the process, your process with us, and we will give you feedback. The fifth item is failing to provide a copy of the background check. That is a violation. And the sixth item here on the common violation list is failing to provide 7 days, at least 7 days, for the applicant to review and respond. Now, a little bit more on that. The state of California has a similar requirement about fair chance, and they require just 5 days. So if you are using a recruiter, an HR professional, or someone to do your hiring, make sure they know the San Francisco Fair Chance Ordinance, and this 7 days is in the ability for the applicant to respond, not 5. That would just be a violation. Next slide, please. So best practices, as I mentioned, review your process, review what we have on our website, and slowly go through these items of what is a compliant hiring process. We have a frequently asked documents with answers on our website, as well as a recorded webinar to just review. Closing up, as I mentioned, this is a process law. There's a lot of details and information in the process. So gain an understanding of the necessary steps to comply with the Hcso. And once you do that, you have questions or you just need some feedback, we're happy and ready here to work with you. Next slide. This is our direct contact information to our Fair Chance Ordinance unit. That's our telephone number, email address, as well as a direct link to the Fair Chance webpage. Next. So I'm just going to move on to the consideration of salary history ordinance. Next slide. A little bit about the history regarding this law. This ordinance wanted to ensure that an individual's prior earnings, which reflect widespread, long-standing, gender-based wage disparities in the labor market, would not continue to weigh down a woman's salary throughout the career. Next slide. So this particular ordinance was created and adopted. It is in effect, and this is for people of all genders. And really what it is that employers may not ask applicants about their current or past salary when you are trying to hire someone and perhaps promotions. Now, if you're an employer and someone calls you asking for a reference and salary information, you cannot and you may not disclose a current or former employee's salary information without the employee's written authorization, unless if the salary history is publicly available. Next, please. Now, an applicant may choose to share the salary history info voluntarily without prompting. You shouldn't prompt them, but if they share this information, you can consider that information in determining how much the salary to offer that applicant. Now, this law is for citywide companies that's operating citywide, as well as companies who have contracts with the city and county of San Francisco for positions in San Francisco. It applies to the prime proposers, as well as, of course, their sub-consultants. Next slide. Some best practices. Look at your hiring process. As you're going through the fair chance, look at the salary history as well. Make sure that all steps of the hiring process does not inquire about salary history, such as on the job application. Sometimes there are places on the job application where the applicant needs to put down their current salary or past salary. You need to remove that those boxes and fields from your job application if you have that. A second, please inform everyone involved in the hiring process about the requirements under this law. Your application may be compliant, but when an applicant goes in and has an interview with someone and your staff doesn't know about this, they may ask something that puts you in violation. So share this information with others in your company. Next slide. This is the direct contact information for the salary history unit. Please feel free to contact us if you have any other questions, and you can look at our webpage for more resources. Next slide. Now we're going to move on to city contractor labor laws. We just finished the section with two labor laws, the Fair Chance and the Salary History Ordinance, which are labor laws for both citywide and now city contractors. Now we're just going to get into city contract labor laws specifically. I am going to hand it off to my colleague Ying Wu, who will present on prevailing wage requirements. Hi, Ying.
Hi, thank you, Beverly. Thank you, everyone. If we can go to the next slide. My name is Ying, and I'm the compliance officer with the Office of Labor Standards Enforcement Prevailing Wage Unit. So throughout today's presentation, we're going to go over the basics of prevailing wage requirements, as well as the tips of how to stay in compliance. Next, please. So what is prevailing wage? Prevailing wage originated during the Depression era, and there are currently about 38 states nationwide that have these laws. It requires all public works projects that are funded by the federal, state, and or local government to be paid prevailing wages. Traditional prevailing wage is the total hourly wage rate plus the benefits paid on public works projects for a particular craft, classification, or the type of work that was being performed on site. So you can see it in the chart here. We have the basic hourly rate, which includes the overtime and holiday pay, and we'll factor into it, plus the benefits such as the pension, vacation, retirement, health and welfare. The two of them comprise of the total hourly rate. Next, please. What is public works? Public works refers to infrastructure projects that's paid for in whole or in part of public funds. Below are the 4 projects that are funded by the federal government. So the Davis-Bacon would apply for the federal building at 7th and Market Street. Others are the Bay Bridge rebuild project that was funded by the state. So the state prevailing wage would apply. And next, we have the Bus Rapid Transit project that was funded by San Francisco locally. So the Chapter 6 is going to apply. And we have other projects that are funded by other government agencies, such as the Golden Gate Bridge Suicide Deterrent Net System. So that project requires prevailing wage payments. And also because they're so unique in a way that was specially established for this project. So it was governed by the Golden Gate Bridge District. Next, please. So what is public works? The California Labor Code section defines public works in their subsection 1720A1 and 1771. It's defined as construction, alteration, demolition, installation, maintenance, or repair work that has to be done under contracts and paid for in whole or in part of public funds. And the contract amount has to be over $1,000. And throughout the time, it actually expands the definition of public works to pre-construction activities, such as the soil material testing, land surveying, and other pre-construction activities. Also, the construction being performed during the design phase, site assessment, feasibility study, and or other pre-construction phases, regardless of whether any further construction work would be conducted later on. And we have the post-construction activities, such as a final cleanup, that is also considered as public works. And in 2016, the state passed the law, AB 219, to include the delivery of the ready-mix concrete drivers. So all of them are considered as public works projects. Next, please. Within the public works project, we have mentioned that San Francisco governs public works or improvement contracting policies and procedures in the city. So the Chapter 6 under the San Francisco Administrative Code would apply for construction works and in the 6 departments within San Francisco. The 6 departments are MTA, which is the Municipal Transportation Agency, and we have the airport, SFO. We have San Francisco PUC, Rec and Park, San Francisco Public Works, and Port of San Francisco. So one easy way to remember Chapter 6 is the number 6 means it covers 6 different departments in the city. Next, please. So what must a public works contractors do to comply with the law? Well, first, they have to stay registered with the DIR when they're working or when they're bidding in a public works project. They have to comply with the apprenticeship requirements. They have to maintain and furnish payroll records, and which means that they would need to submit the CPRs to us, to LCP Tracker, and to the state, which is the DIR. They need to pay the correct prevailing wage rate to all workers for the craft, classification, and the type of work that they performed. And we're going to go over it one by one with you. Next slide is going to be the registration requirement. The first link is for you to register if you haven't done so. The registration and the renewal period is from July 1st to June 30th. So it doesn't matter when you register with the state, it always expires on June 30th. And that's why I always recommend the contractors out there, if you're planning to bid on public works project, just do it now instead of waiting. There is a registration fee that is non-refundable, and the amount is $400. And if you forgot or you fail to register with the state, but you bid on a public works project, or you have been awarded a public works project, the state department can issue a penalty of $2,000 against you. But again, OLC does not enforce this provision of the law. It's the state, the DIR, the Department of Industrial Relations, they do. So this is a courtesy reminder for you. And also the DIR established a exemption for small public works projects that is under $25,000, or a small maintenance project that is under $15,000. Next, please. So other than the penalty that we had mentioned, there are other consequences if you fail to register. One is that you cannot bid or work in a public works project without registering. And you can be removed from any public works projects that you are working on. Other than the $2,000 penalties, there's also a $400 registration fee that you would need to pay for violation in a 12-month period. If you are lucky and you renew your registration within the 90 days grace period, then your penalty is going to reduce from $2,000 to $400. But you still need to pay another $400 for the registration renewal fee. And if you are contracting with an unregistered contractor or subcontractor, such contract can be subject to cancellation. So which means if you are a subcontractor being hired by your prime and you fail to register, your prime can actually replace you with another subcontractor who is registered. Next, please. The next requirement is apprentices. Contractors working on a public works project that's valued at $30,000 or more have an obligation to hire apprentices. You need to register in a state-approved apprenticeship program and make sure that you are making the training fund contributions to a state-approved apprenticeship program or to CAC. CAC means California Apprenticeship Council. It is a state department where they collect the training fund for statewide public works projects. The link below can refer you to the website for the DAS, the Division of Apprenticeship Standards. And if you're looking into the wage determination, and you see that there is a pound sign or hashtag before it, then that means the craft is apprenticeable. So you would need to hire apprentices for that craft. If you do not see any notation or you see a double pound sign, then that means the craft is not apprenticeable. Then you don't need to hire the apprentices for that specific craft. There is a minimum ratio requirement. In general, there is a 1 apprentice hour to every 5 journey person hour, which is the 20% of the total journey person straight time hours for each of the craft. But please confirm with the California Division of Apprenticeship Standards, which is DAS, for the details on the specific craft. And the hours are calculated at the end of the project. But again, the apprenticeship provision are not enforceable by us or by the city. So we only enforce the prevailing wage requirements for the apprentices. If you fail to submit certain apprenticeship forms to the state, or if you fail to meet the minimum ratio requirements with the state, then the state may start an investigation against you. So this is a courtesy reminder that you need to follow all these laws. Next, please. Okay, so this one we do enforce. This is the certified payroll records, the requirements for submission. And all contractors must maintain and provide payroll records on a weekly basis to all workers employed on public works projects. They have to be certified under the penalty of perjury. And the contractor have to submit their certified payrolls, or we call it CPRs, and fringe benefit statements into the system called LCP Tracker. This is a city system to collect your CPRs. Failure to provide payroll records to us within 10 days after the receipt of a written request is subject to a $100 penalty per worker per day. So please make sure that you are submitting your CPRs on a timely manner, okay? If you do have any questions about LCP Tracker where you had some technical difficulties or you are new to LCP Tracker, I would definitely recommend you to come to our free LCP Tracker training. That is the free webinar, live webinar on second Tuesday of every month. And if you're not available to attend, then we offer pre-recorded webinars covering the basics of submitting CPRs. They're all available on our website. Next, please. So when we mention about CPRs, who must be reported in the CPRs? The answer is all workers that's performing the cover work must be reported regardless of their status or their title, which means even if you're a partner of your company, your owner-operator, independent contractor, president, vice president, superintendents, things like that, if you perform the cover work under Public Works, you have to report yourself or you have to report those workers. On the other hand, if you do not perform those work, then you don't need to report on the CPRs. And when you're reporting on the CPRs, make sure that you are reporting the classification that is in accordance with the type of work being performed. So say, for example, we are having some plumbers to come in to fix the plumbing system of a building, but then they were being classified and paid as a laborer, then it's going to be constitute as a violation for misclassification. So please do match the work with the classification that you're paying or claiming on the CPR. Next, please. What happens if prevailing wage are not paid? Well, first of all, you will have to pay the restitution payments, and we will have to assess back wages, plus the penalties of not less than $50, but not more than $200 per worker per day. So please be complied with the law. And during the investigation, we do request for the proof of payments, such as the canceled checks, evidence of the fringe benefit payments, pay stubs, timesheet, things like that. Next, please. All right, so this slide is also a law that is established or passed by the state, but we do not enforce. This is the Skilled and Trained Workforce SB 693. It requires to use the skilled and trained workforce for public works projects. And all workers must be 1, a skilled journey person, or 2, a DAS registered apprentices. So who considered as a skilled journey person? It has to be a graduate, a person graduated from a DAS approved apprenticeship program, which is a state program, or they have to be graduated from a DOL, which is a federal approved apprenticeship program, or they will have to have the on-the-job experience that equals or more than the number of hours required to graduate in a DAS approved apprenticeship program. And there are 2 exemptions being applied. They are if the work being performed is less than 10 hours in a calendar month for each craft, or if the sub is not listed in the bid and the contract amount does not exceed half of 1% of the total project cost, then they will be exempt from the SB 693. But for details of the exemptions or for more information about these SB 693, definitely contact the State Department, the DIR, or visit their website that's being stated in this slide. Next, please. All right, so after we went over the Chapter 6 and the basics of the prevailing wage requirements, let's go over the Chapter 23 and its related requirements. The Board of Supervisors passed the Chapter 23 specifically for private developments on city-owned or leased property or private housing development that was sold or transferred by the city. It mandates prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements on private developments on city-owned or leased property, and also the private housing development on property that was sold or transferred by the city. The operative date was April 20th, 2016. Next slide, we would have examples of the private development on city-owned or leased property. That is the Pier 70. It was leased by the city for private development and renovation for exchange of a long-term lease as a tenant. So that is covered under Chapter 23, even though there is no public funding. The next one is in the next slide, and that is also the 30 Venice. It was sold by the city for residential development. There's no public funding to build it, but because it triggered Chapter 23, prevailing wage also applied. All right, so if we can go to the next slide, we have a hot topic. This is the Citywide Project Labor Agreement, the PLA. So as you all know, that the PLA was signed and took effect July 14th of last year. If we can go to the next slide, we can see the details of the Citywide PLA. The PLA is an agreement between the city and the County of San Francisco and the San Francisco Building Trades Council and its affiliated unions. The legislative intent is to promote the efficiency and cost effectiveness of a construction operation in the city through the use of the skilled labor, resulting in a quality construction outcome. So the PLA only applies to the cover contracts that are issued by 1, the Public Works Department, and 2, the Rec and Park Department. Next, please. You must ask, what is considered as a cover project under the Citywide PLA? Well, like I said before, the project has to be advertised by the DPW or the Rec and Park if one of the following conditions are met. One is a project that is funded in whole or in part by the general obligation or the revenue bonds, and the estimated construction cost exceeds the following thresholds. So it would be $5 million from July 14th of last year until July 13th of this year. And from what we are having now, it's going to be $3 million from July 14th until July 13th of next year. And it's going to be reduced to $1 million after July 14th of 2022. And if you are having a project that is funded by any sources other than the above mentioned bonds, and the estimated construction cost is going to be more than $10 million, it's going to trigger the PLA, Citywide PLA. But please be noted that the cover project does not include any public works or improvement projects undertaken by other departments, such as the airport, the PUC, the port, SFMTA, and also just so for you to know that the airport and also the PUC, they have their own PLAs. So this Citywide PLA basically only applies to 2 departments, okay? Cover project also does not include the professional services contracts with a consultant, project manager, construction manager, or design team. If a project is funded by both the general funds and the bonds, then the higher standard, which means the lower dollar amount, would trigger the Citywide PLA. Next, please. All right, so if you are a local business enterprise, an LBE, then you are in luck because we have a LBE exemption for the Citywide Pla. The qualifying LBEs are exempt from the terms and conditions of the PLA, but all of the following will have to be met. Well, first, the LBE must be certified by the CMD under the Admin Code Chapter 14B. And the LBE exemption applies to the LBEs whose accumulated payments are less than $5 million on Citywide PLA covered projects. If you are an LBE and wishing to be exempt from the PLA, you must sign and submit a statement of exemption and make sure that you're submitting it to us. The LBEs who have been issued $5 million in cumulative payments on covered projects are no longer exempt from the PLA, which means that you will have to comply with the PLA. If the prime contractor is an LBE exempt and they work in a PLA project, once they receive a $5 million in payment, that means that they would lose the exemption. Okay. And then the exemption expires on every current and ongoing covered projects. However, the prime's LBE status would not affect the subcontractor's LBE exemption status. Next, please. Okay, so what are the best practices for construction-related prevailing wage compliance? Well, first, you will have to attend the pre-bid pre-con meetings. So make sure that you get all the information possible, for that specific projects. And you will need to submit the certified payrolls on a regular basis to LCP tracker. You need to maintain and furnish the payroll records and fringe contributions records. You need to contact OLCE if you have any questions regarding the prevailing wage. Next, please. And we have some common compliance issues that the contractor raised throughout the period that we are monitoring the projects. One is that you need to pay attention to the predetermined changes. The reason is that there is a applicable wage determination that remains in effect for the lifetime of the project. So if you are looking up the newest wage determination, it's not going to be helpful or accurate. So you would need to look up the predetermined changes associated with a specific wage determination to get the best or the most accurate information on the rates and the changes of the rates. The second compliance issue is that we have some non-signatory contractors who is paying their training fund to their employees. And that is going to be a violation because the training fund has to be contributed to an approved apprenticeship program or to CAC, which is the California Apprenticeship Council. It cannot be paid to the workers directly. The next is that we have some plumbers union or inside wireman, plumbers contractors or inside wireman contractors or sheet metal contractors in San Francisco. If you are planning to work in public works projects, make sure that you are not going over 7 hours in a week. Because if you go over 7 hours 7 hours in a day, not in a week. So if you go over 7 hours in a day, that means it's going to trigger the daily overtime. Okay, next, please. All right, so we are going to go over the San Francisco Administrative Chapter 21C. This is the administrative code established by the Board of Supervisors, and it's for 10 prevailing wage classifications for the work that is not recognized by the state, by DIR. And that is not public works projects. That is non-construction related. It applies to San Francisco service contracts, leases, management agreements, and permits. It applies to work performed at any facilities or properties that's owned or leased by the city. Next page, we will have 10 different categories of the Chapter 21C classifications. And these are the years that they were passed by the board. Due to the time of this training or presentation, we will go over only a few of the most common classifications or most common work. Next slide, we would have the Janitorial Services, 21C.2. These are any contracts that's signed with the city on or after January 16, 2004. The 21C prevailing wage for janitorial services would apply. The current total hourly rate, including the fringes, for employees who worked more than 4,850 hours is $34.12 per hour. We'll have the health and welfare contributions, $9 per hour, when an employee is working for this employer for at least 4 months and a minimum of 105 hours in the previous month. If they work more than 7.5 hours in a day, it's going to require overtime payments. So please note that if the health and welfare payments are not required for certain subclassification of the janitorial services, other San Francisco benefit requirements such as Hcso, Healthcare Security Ordinance, may still apply. There are 2 exemptions under the janitorial services. The one is that if you're a nonprofit organization providing work experience for people with disabilities, you don't need to pay the janitorial services hours, the hourly rate. And services performed under the jurisdiction of the Airport Commission, you are exempt from the 21C.2 as well, because they may have another CBA. All right, next, we are going to have the window cleaning. Window cleaners is one of the subclassification of the janitorial services. That's why it's under the 21C.2. And it established about 3 years later in December 13, 2007. The total hourly rate, including the fringes for journey person with 39 hours worked in the industry, is $39.48 per hour. The health and welfare contribution is $9.27 per hour when the employee works at least 975 hours and a minimum of 75 hours in the previous month. The overtime with the 7.5 hours would also apply for the window cleaner. And the journey person rate must be paid to all employees with 3,900 hours worked in the window cleaning industry. There is a ratio of any 1 trainee to 4 journey person window cleaner that shall not be exceeded. The same exemption that apply to the janitorial services would also apply to the window cleaners. And they all are the nonprofit organization to provide work experience for people with disability and also for the airport service contracts. Okay. Next, please. All right. So besides the janitorial services, we have another popular service contract is the security guard service, which is the 21C.11. It was established on June 2nd, 2017. So any contracts that was signed with the city on or after June 2nd, 2017, security guard service, the rate would apply. And the total hourly rate, including the fringes, is $20.36 per hour. But keep a reminder to yourself that this is only for Security Officer 1, with health benefit for employees only hired after January 1st, 2021. There are different steps or different rates for security officers with different experiences, okay? There's an amendment to extend the current MCO and Hcso contracts that would trigger the 21C.11. There is no waiver on the health and welfare contribution, which is the Hcso waiver provision does not apply to the prevailing wage rate. But Hcso may apply if the employer has 20 or more employees. And when you're looking at the wage sheet, because there are so many different classifications or subclassifications under the security guard, and there are different healthcare requirements, please pay attention at the footnotes to make sure that you are paying the correct rate for the employees that you are hiring. Next we have the 21C.7. This is not a prevailing wage classification, but all contracts, leases, agreements, or permits under 21C.1 through 11 are covered. What that means is that if you are a successor of a service company, okay, you will have to retain employees from the previous contractor or previous service provider, vendor, for a 6-month transition employment period. The people who are covered are the previous contractor's employees. And if the employee's performance during the 6-month period is satisfactory, then the successor contractor shall offer continued employment to the employees. So when the contracting officer has given notice that a cover contract will be bid, or where a contractor has given notice of termination, upon giving or receiving such notice, the ending contractor shall, within 10 days, thereafter provide to the contracting officer and the purchaser for each employee who worked at least 15 hours per week for the ending contractor, the name, the date of hire, number of hours, and the month worked in the total for the employer, wage rates, and the employment occupation classification. This provision shall also apply to the subcontractors of the ending contractors. But please be noted that OLC, we do not enforce this provision. But any individuals that was covered in this provision can bring a legal action to a civil court. Okay. Next, please. So what are the best practice and common compliance issues under 21C? First thing is, like I said before, because there are so many different types of health and welfare or pension payments for each of the subclassifications with different work experiences, you need to pay attention to the footnotes on the wage charts. And the second thing is, any work that was being performed on a named holiday, you would need to pay time and a half, which is the overtime rate. If they worked over 8 hours on that holiday, you would need to compensate them at double time, which is 2 times of the hourly rate. Employee would also have to receive the holiday pay regardless if they are working or scheduled to work. If the employer has 20 or more employees, the Hcso may apply. Next, please. Okay, so a quick reminder of or summary of what I just mentioned is that as a contractor that is contracting with the city, you need to pay the workers in accordance with the type of work that's being performed. You need to keep accurate payroll records. You need to submit the CPRs and the LCP tracker to the LCP tracker, and also to the state, which is the DIR, for construction-related craft only, though. And you also need to inform your subs and your sub-tiers of the prevailing wage requirements. Next. If you have any questions after this live webinar for prevailing wage side of it, feel free to call us at the number provided in here, or you can email us or visit our website at www.sfgov.org/OSE/prevailing wage. All right, thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Hi there. My name is Beverly Popek, and I am going to present on the Minimum Compensation Ordinance, also known as MCO. Next slide, please. So this information about what this really applies to is really not only just for the Minimum Compensation Ordinance, but the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance. And these two labor laws are for non-construction workers who work on city and county contracts. So Ying just took us through prevailing wage requirements, and they're very job specific. So if you're not sure whether or not it falls under prevailing wage, you should look it up. And if it does not fall under prevailing wage, it falls under MCO and Hco. So this information would be you. Now, the jobs in terms of what is covered and what is not can be located anywhere in the United States. If the city hires you to perform services, you don't have to perform the services in the city and county of San Francisco for some of the contracts. For some specific contracts, maybe, but work can be performed throughout the United States, and that work in other parts of the United States would be covered under the MCO and Hcao. So let's get at some specific examples of jobs that are covered under these two laws. So any clerical, administrative staff who support the contract, project managers, construction managers, they don't fall under prevailing wage. They fall under MCO and Hco, as well as caseworkers, program managers, architects, engineers, planners, designers, and other professional services. Next slide, please. So what is this really about? This MCO, the Minimum Compensation Ordinance, is about compensation. And compensation is defined as wages and paid time off for the MCO. Next slide. So getting into if you're covered, if you're for-profit or nonprofit, if you have 5 employees anywhere in the world, you have a contract with the city and county of San Francisco, you're a covered employer. Now, this law, as well as all of our contract laws, trickles down from the prime, the company who holds the contract, to the subcontractors who you as a prime may hire to perform parts of the contract for you. Now, if you're a covered employer, you have to ask yourself, do you have any covered employees? And for the MCO, it's anyone working for a covered employer on the contract, and they're performing work on the contract. And it doesn't matter if they're full-time, part-time, casual, etc. Next slide, please. So here are the wage requirements for the MCO. So effective July 1st, and this is when we have our possible increases for the MCO. It's $18.55 per hour for for-profit entities. If you're a nonprofit, it's $17.34 per hour. This increase usually happens, of course, on July 1st, but it is based on the Consumer Price Index. Next, please. The second part about the MCO that is really not well known and forgotten in terms of the compensation part of the MCO is that there are paid time off requirements. Essentially what it is that you as an employer need to accrue at least 0.04615 hours of paid time off per hour worked for each employee working on the contract. If someone's working 40 hours a week, that's about 12 days per year. Now, the PTO is the property of the worker, and it needs to be paid out upon termination. It does cap at 96 hours and rolls over to the following years. Now, you may have existing vacation and PTO policies that may be in compliance with this requirement. And if you take a look, as long as you see that the total time off meets the minimum accrual, you're okay. If you're not sure, you can always contact us and you can send us a copy of your policies so that we can calculate and make sure and just check. Now, PTO violations are the most common violations for the minimum compensation ordinance. A lot of times people think that the MCO is a minimum wage requirement for city contractors. Yes, but that's not the whole equation. As you can see, there's a paid time off requirement. Next slide, please. So there's also an unpaid time off requirement for the MCO. Use the accrual rate of 0.03846 hours. It caps at 80 hours and it rolls over to the following year. You may have existing sick leave policies or other unpaid policies that might meet this requirement. If you're not sure, review, combine, and contact us. Now look, if your firm offers at least 22 days of PTO per year, additional unpaid time off is not required. I would highly recommend that you go to our MCO webpage and download our rules and regulations regarding paid time off and unpaid time off, because we have a lot of details and good information on how to understand and administer these benefits. Next slide, please. So this is really important for you to understand, and we want to avoid non-compliance because there are penalties. You need to repay wages to employees plus interest if you owe them any sort of shortfall or wages. If there's ever any PTO issues, the Office of Labor Standards would ask you to restore those accruals to the current employees or cash out the PTO owed to former employees. There could be a fine of up to $100 per week, and there could even be a failure to cooperate fee if you don't cooperate. But lastly, we, the city, may terminate your contractor lease or withhold payment to you if you are not in compliance. So the best thing to do, and you're all here, is be proactive, work with us, and ensure that you're in compliance from day one before you start or as you start your contract with the City and County of San Francisco. Next slide. This is contact information that you can use to go to the MCO webpage, as well as our unit hotline number for more information. Next slide, please. So moving on over to the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance. We just went through MCO, which is wages and time off requirements. There is the healthcare component, and this is the law for you. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, it is a contract requirement, and it applies to contracts for services and leases. Now, here's something a little bit different. If you are involved with a grant, and grants are exempt from the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance, but you may need to comply with the Healthcare Security Ordinance, because if you're operating, providing services for the city, in the city and county of San Francisco, that is a basic citywide law that you have to comply with anyway. So that is something to keep in mind if you are applying or you have grants. Next, please. So let's look at who's covered in terms as an employer and employee. This is a little bit different from the minimum compensation ordinance. Under the Hcso, if you are for profit, you need to have at least 20 or more employees anywhere in the world to be a covered employer. If you are a nonprofit, you need to have 50 or more employees. Now, as mentioned before, these laws trickle down or apply to your subcontractors. So that's something to share and keep them in the loop regarding compliance. Also, as an employer, you must have a city contract. This whole section is only for city contracts, or perhaps a lease on city property, including the airport or the port.
Beverly, if I could interrupt you for
Yes.
1 second. Sorry, apologies for the interruption. We understand that the slides are not advancing on YouTube. We're getting this technical issue wrapped up, and just so everyone knows, we'll also send out this presentation. So if there's anything that you've missed, we'll make sure that you have that, but it should be updated very soon, if not now. Thanks so much, Beverly, and apologies again for the interruption.
Just let me know when to continue.
You can proceed.
Sure. So now that we understand who's covered as an employer, let's look at who are potentially covered employees or workers. So anyone who's working for a covered employer on a city contract at least 20 hours a week. 20 hours is really the threshold that you must look at. Next slide, please. So the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance has 3 options. You, the employer, you get to choose how you'd like to comply with it. And you need to make a choice based upon the options that fit the situation and or the employee. So the first option that's available in every single location in the United States is to, number 1, offer a covered employee a compliant health plan at no charge to the employee. Eligibility, it's no later than the first of the month after 30 days, and it must be a compliant health plan, meaning it has to meet all of the Hcso minimum standards for the health plan. Now, this is above and beyond the ACA health plan, and there is a specific document on the Hcso website that you need to review or perhaps give to your insurance broker to review and make sure that the plan is compliant. My best tip and advice is to have your insurance broker work with us and the Department of Public Health to review and make sure this plan is compliant per the minimum standards. So we can offer advice before you sign a 1-year contract and get locked into perhaps a non-compliant plan that puts you in violation from day 1. Lastly, the offer must be made on an annual basis. So it's an annual basis, and we have some tips and information on how to do that on our website. Next slide, please. So as mentioned before, best practices is before signing a contract with your insurance broker and insurance company, have the Department of Public Health review the health plan and give feedback. You can contact us so that we can put you in touch with the Department of Public Health. In addition, you should save all correspondence that the health plan has met the Hcso minimum standards. The Department of Public Health and perhaps I will give you such information in writing to keep for your records. Next slide. So that's the first option. If that option is something that you don't want to do or you'd like to do, but it's going to take a little while, you always have another option. So option 2 is available for employees working in San Francisco at the airport or at the San Bruno jail. And simply what this is paying a fee to be in compliance. The money goes directly to the San Francisco General Hospital, but this is not healthy SF. This is not the city contributions or options that was associated and you heard about under the Healthcare Security Ordinance. This is completely different, and it is not a benefit to any of the workers you are paying for. Currently, the rate is $5.85 per hour, and the rate is adjusted every July 1st. So just remember that this is an option only for people working in San Francisco at the airport or at the jail. That's if you don't want to do option one. It can also be done as a temporary compliance solution as you shop and search for the compliant health plan. Please advance the slide. So this is not another reminder that the paying an additional $5.60 per hour to the employee is an option 3. And this is only an option if you have employees outside of the city and county of San Francisco, outside of the airport, and outside of the jail working for you on the contract. So Oakland, Pacifica, Daly City, Marin, Texas, Boston, you name it. This could be a potential option to comply with the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance by paying the additional fee amount directly per hour work to the employee. Now, there are some best practices in terms of how to do that. I would contact my office, contact our office, and we can give you the best practices in terms to how to make this happen. Next slide, please. I want to advise you that there has been an Hcso expansion at the San Francisco International Airport. And there was an amendment to the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance that requires specific employers at the airport to provide additional health benefits to an employee's family. We're not covering this here today, but if you go to our Hco webpage, you will see there is a link to the Hcao amendment, also known as the Healthy Airport Ordinance, HAO, and we have on-demand webinars, handouts, and lots of information. If you are in that situation, please go there and you will find plenty of information to assist you. Next slide, please. So this is a common question that we get, and I think more from Healthcare Security Ordinance kind of told you that this may come up. What if your worker is not covered under the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance and you're performing work in the city and county of San Francisco? That means that your worker does not perform 20 hours or more per week on the city contract, but they're working in San Francisco. Then you may need to comply with the Healthcare Security Ordinance. This is just the Hcso, the Healthcare Security Ordinances team's direct contact information. Double check if you're a covered employer, if you have covered employees, and this particular law may be relevant to you. Please advance the slide. So as we like to be proactive and avoid violations, let's talk about why it's super important for you to really review this and work with us ahead of time. There are penalties for non-compliance. So you may have to pay an Hco fee owed to the San Francisco General Hospital or employees if you got it wrong, if you violated the law. Most of the cases that we have in this particular unit are voluntary compliance cases where employers have come forward to us and said, I don't think it did this right, but I guess it's a violation. Yes, it is a violation. And in those cases, we always welcome you if you don't have a current case open with us. And the great part about the voluntary compliance program for Healthcare Accountability Ordinance, as well as the minimum compensation ordinance, is that if there are any penalty like liquidated damages, we do not charge those. And if you owe any fees to the hospital, we started off at 50%. So we encourage you to talk to us, come to us, and if you indeed think you violated the law, please, we can work with you. Some of the other corrective actions or penalties for non-compliance is that we may ask you to reimburse employees out-of-pocket medical expenses, such as insurance premiums if you charge them for it by accident. There may be a fine of up to $100 per employee per week and a $1,000 failure to cooperate, a penalty if you don't cooperate with us. And then ultimately, just like for the minimum compensation ordinance, if you're not cooperating and you're not complying, the city may terminate your contractor lease or withhold payment to you. Next slide, please. Again, these are the direct contact information for the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance and Hcso. It's actually a combined unit. So feel free to contact us and go to our website. The bottom website that's listed here is the OLSC general website. And from there, you'll be able to navigate to many, many labor laws, the ones that you have seen presentations for today, and much, much more. Thank you again, and please advance to the next slide.
All right, thank you so much, Beverly, and apologies again for the brief technical interruption. And thanks to the whole team, Lynn Mora, Bernice, Beverly, and Ying, for all the wealth of information in your presentations that you've provided. For our viewers, we're going to be entering our second Q&A session before the end of this SF Labor Laws workshop. So if you haven't already, please send your questions into cityadmin.events@sfgov.org. And we have several questions that are lined up already, so I'm going to jump right in and start to share those with our speakers. So the first question is on the Fair Chance Ordinance. The question is, when can an employer run a background check?
Hi there. So you can run a background check once you have made a conditional offer of employment. And of course, you're getting that applicant's permission to run the background check.
Okay, great. Thanks, Beverly. One more question on Fair Chance. Does the Fair Chance Ordinance require me to hire a person with a criminal history?
No, the Fair Chance Ordinance is about having a compliant hiring process. There's a lot of details involved with it, and I would certainly look at our website and review or contact us directly so that we can go through what the compliant hiring process is and compare it to perhaps what you're currently doing to help you quickly figure out if you have a compliant hiring process.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, moving to a separate topic now, question here on the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance. How does work location impact which options I can choose from to comply with the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance?
Sure, so there's three options. The first option of offering a compliant health plan at no charge to an employee is available at any location in the United States. The second option of paying a fee directly to the hospital would only be for workers performing work in the city and county of San Francisco, or maybe at the airport, or maybe at the San Bruno jail. If you have employees working on the contract outside of those places, for example, Marin, Oakland, other parts of the United States, Alaska, then you have the option of paying the fee amount directly to the employee. So that's how the locations work with the three different options. We also have a quick little YouTube video on the Hcso webpage. It's under 3 minutes and it goes through the three options and it really runs it down with the locations.
That's super helpful. Thanks for clarifying that, Beverly. Let's see, I'll just pull down to our next question that we've received here. This is on minimum compensation ordinance. So the question is, when an employee terminates, do we have to pay at a minimum the Hcso compensation rate or their final rate of pay, which may be higher than the Hcso compensation rate?
So you need to pay the final rate of pay when the employee terminates, when you're cashing out the paid time off.
Okay, Perfect. And then just one more on minimum compensation ordinance. What types of workers are covered under the minimum compensation ordinance?
Sure. So this sounds, it's any positions that's not covered under prevailing wage, but usually you would think about professional services positions, such as architects, engineers, designers, case managers. There are people in the construction company who don't fall under prevailing wage, such as construction managers and schedulers. And of course, you can think of all of our administrative assistants, admin people that work in, say, a construction office, or just perhaps in the general office supporting the contract for the city and county of San Francisco. If you are certainly unsure because you are overwhelmed with a lot of information today, you can review which positions fall under prevailing wage. And if it's not listed there, it would probably fall under MCO and Hcso. And you can always contact our office and we'll assist you.
Great, thank you. It looks like we have one last question coming in. This is from Alex, and Alex asks, if I am only one employee and my company gets projects from a city department, does my company need to have business health insurance?
So under the healthcare accountability, and then I'm assuming a lot of things, I don't even know what you do, Alex, but let's just say your position would fall under Hcso. Given that you would be the only employee, the employer does not have 20 or more employees anywhere in the world. So under that information, and my assumption here is that the employer does not have to comply with the healthcare accountability ordinance. Certainly, if there's other details and information you'd like to share, please contact us and we can discuss it with you.
Thanks, Beverly. And then Alex will make sure to share this presentation out so that you'll have contact information for our experts at OLSC to be able to answer that question with more specificity if you'd like. And I think, well, so we're at 11:50, and that is actually all the time that we have for questions. I want to say a huge thank you to our team at the Office of Labor Standards Enforcement for joining us this morning and sharing with our audience all this great information on labor laws here in our city. Thanks also to the audience for tuning in to the Small Business Summit with us this morning. We are going to take a break for lunch, and we will be back at 1 p.m. for our next session.